Hello and welcome to Building Context. This is a series of videos that we're doing on APIs and API security. My name is Chris Westphal. I head up product marketing here at Salt Security, and I'm joined again by Michael Itzbitsky, our technical evangelist. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be here.
It's great to have you. And we're continuing our conversation. We're talking about this concept of anybody who's securing APIs needing to have a deeper understanding of APIs, and that has to do with a lot of different components. Today's episode, we're really going to focus on the developer side, who's developing these APIs, and I think that provides lots of great and important insight into what it is that you're securing. As security, increasingly you can't operate in a bubble. I think years ago, maybe security could operate in a bubble if you're thinking about securing infrastructure, just the network. I mean, maybe this was 10 plus years ago. But increasingly, you need to know what it is that's traversing that network, and increasingly, you need to know more about the I guess the core components and the details of what that application is made up of. So we want to talk a little bit about that. So the big question is, how can I'd say traditional infrastructure people start to understand application people or developers or DevOps or whatever you want to call them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I used to run into this. In the world of like kind of traditional engineering, there was you unpack that server from the box, right? It came from HP or Dell, whoever your hardware manufacturer of choice was. But yeah, you unboxed that thing, you stuck it in the rack, you plugged it in the cables. Like that still exists, right? Particularly if you're in charge of a data center. But for a lot of practitioners now, you're starting to work more with cloud service providers and cloud services. So increasingly, things are more virtual, right? It exists somewhere in some data center, but you don't have control over that physical asset. The reality is with that kind of cloud enablement and also kind of like DevOps principles, but it's kind of the codification of everything, right? Because to automate, you really need things to be in some form of code. So kind of what's happening in network engineering and infrastructure and ops is this automation is occurring, right? So now if I need a network switch, I'm not going to put that in a data center physically. I'm just going to instantiate, like an elastic load balancer somewhere. And, if I need more capacity, I'm just going to scale up or out. And that usually happens through code, right? And it's typically we call those things infrastructure as code, but they're different types of code formats. So, engineers are likely being faced with this anyway if they are tasked with infrastructure. Working with these types of code, it's very much what an application developer has been faced with, right? And I'd often hear that too, like as an engineer, do I have to learn to code now? And it's like, it's like somewhat in between, right? It's kind of like scripting, but it can look like programming. And some tooling is better at helping you with that. But yeah, it's kind of like you have to expose yourself to that. Talk with app development teams, understand kind of how they work, how do they take in requirements to build, right? And it's going to be very similar for how you define your infrastructure as code. And workflows are similar, right? Developers these days tend to work with Git-based workflows, checking in code to Git-based version control. That triggers your builds, with CI/CD. In infrastructure, you have the concept of GitOps workflow, right? So it's still very Git centric. You're still checking in your code. It's just different types of code formats. And now you can instantiate infrastructure or reconfigure it much more real time, right? Instead of I have to I got to procure the thing, unpack it, get in the data center, right? Or plug in a cable. And it's like, hey, it was time consuming. Like it's great. Like if you had all the time in the world, and it feels that way, right? Like for any of us that did that back in those days, it was like those were the glory days, right? But now, it's much more rapid. You have to build and deploy very rapidly.
Well, so if I am what I'll consider to be a traditional security guy and I want to start connecting with people on the DevOps side, who do I look for? Who do I target? Is it, do I start at the top? Do I look for team leads? Do I just go pick a random
Yeah,
developer out of the directory and start there? Where would you recommend?
it's a good question. I mean, it, it usually evolves. I've seen both approaches, like top down, and usually that's like a security champions or security coaches type program.
Yeah,
Some agile methodologies will kind of have these centers of excellence, but it can be structured that way. But depending where you are in your organization, like if it needs to be more grassroots, typically what I'd say is, uh, as you're working on standing up infrastructure, you're likely going to encounter uh, somebody in the application development role that maybe has an inclination of how infrastructure works. So
yeah,
that's probably going to be the right person, or security, right? Like, so how is this thing built? Like I'm building my app, but I want to know how does this thing run? Like who's architecting it and then securing it? So like that type of personality is typically the person you'd want to look for, right? Because
okay,
they're going to be more collaborative, open to kind of communicating, working together, and then certainly educating, right? And it goes both ways, So the subject matter expertise you have as an infrastructure or security person is certainly going to benefit the person in the development role, and vice versa.
yeah,
That's kind of when you talk about DevSecOps or just DevOps, you see those types of principles emerge where it's kind of cross-team collaboration, feedback loops, kind of getting everybody working together. But yeah, I'd
yeah.
say somebody that's more willing to volunteer information or just want to expand a little, understand different
But
pieces of the tech stack.
yeah, and I think that's a good, a good attitude is that thinking about it as a symbiotic relationship, right? It's not just a security versus development. It's something where increasingly, especially with APIs, these two teams need to work together. So coming at it with that concept of both sides having some domain expertise that they can share,
Yeah.
I think is a great way to come at it.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah, and the sooner we can dispel the myth that all security problems are a result of code, the better off everybody will be. Because yeah, like you were
yeah,
saying, Chris, like many API issues we see it's some fusion of many things, right? Maybe it's a
yeah,
code level issue, but it could actually be an access control mechanism. It could be a misconfiguration, might be
yeah.
something with your supply chain and how third party integrated with you. So it's not always, the
It's
developers.
everybody's game at this point. I mean,
Yep.
there are things that can be done on the dev side. There can definitely be things that can be done on the SecOps side at runtime.
Yep.
But there's no such thing as security. There's no single solution that's going to solve all of your problems.
Yep.
So once you make some connections on the dev side, what are some things that a security person is going to want to ask? What do they want to? What is good to understand? Where do you start? Like, what would maybe the top three questions be?
Um, Understanding the workflow, right? Like, typically I'd see how these conversations start with, I need to get my security tooling integrated into your workflow so I can check things. That's almost always a conversation starter. That
Yeah,
could be a little much, right? Because it's like person on the receiving end of that might be thinking, oh, great, now I'm going to get more work, right? Or slowing down my build pipeline. But
yeah,
it, you could start that conversation more with just tell me how you work. Like, what do your release schedules look like? What's some of the tooling you use to develop? Um, how do you commit code? What functional testing do you do? Right? It doesn't have to kind of be, I have the security intent. Tell me how you work, so I can, put my things into
more of
your
it.
to your
Yeah,
workflow. But yeah, that tends to open that conversation path. Like, just tell me how you're working, right? Like, how can we help each other?
yeah,
Because everybody's in the same boat.
yeah. It's true. I think that's great. I think the next for a future episode, what we want to do is kind of get into how a security professional can start sharpening their skills, maybe to help them ask some of these questions and become more informed and know what to look for. So I think making the connection with somebody on the dev side is super important, and understanding those components of what's being built and how it's being built and delivered, and again, the ecosystem around it is super important. But we also want to make sure that folks know how they can get smarter on their own too. With that, thank you for joining and for the insight on the dev side, and we look forward to having you on a future episode.
Yeah, no problem, Chris. Great talking to you.
Right. Thanks,
Take
Michael.
care.